Alrighty, welcome to Chapter 1, the first of many video note walkthroughs for both ANP1 and ANP2. Let's go ahead and start with some definitional terms before we really get into it. First, the difference between anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is referring to the individual structures within the human body. So maybe a bone, or maybe the nose, or maybe an eye. Versus physiology is how all of that works together. So how does the one eye talk to the brain in order for you to actually interpret some sort of image? That would be the physiology behind the human body. Then you have pathology, and pathology is anything that is going wrong with the body. That usually means it's in some sort of state of disease. So patho refers to anything that is in a disease state, and ology at the end means the study of, so the study of disease. For the rest of this chapter, we're basically going to go over some big bird's eye view items of all of the chapters within this entire book, which are essentially all of the individual body systems, all the individual parts of those body systems, and how they all work together and in tandem with each other. For the rest of this chapter, we're going to identify some directional terms that are really important for clinicians and anatomists to be able to talk to one another about what they are actually referring to about a patient or a subject. We'll also talk about planes, same thing as part of the directionality. There's a good video online that's already linked for a visual interpretation of what's going on in the planes, which can be really useful. We'll also talk about cavities, which is where all of the organs are going to be stored. And then we'll talk about the individual organ systems one by one. So first, we'll talk about direction. And like I said, this is really important because if someone comes into the clinic, let's say, and they have pain right there, with that point right there, how do you actually explain to someone else who doesn't have a visual sense of what's going on with the patient? Maybe they're in another room, maybe they haven't even looked at the patient. How would you explain exactly where that point of pain is? So this is just another set of tools that we use in the clinic and as anatomists, as another part of the language of how we can actually talk to one another about what's going on for individual people. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk through one by one what each of these terms mean and some examples of how you would use them. So first, I'd like to start with, towards the right-hand side of the image here, anterior and posterior. So anterior means towards the front, while posterior means towards the back. So anterior, you might say that the belly button is anterior to the spine, and you might say that the spine is posterior to the belly button. You see here that there's also ventral and dorsal. Ventral and dorsal are typically used in animal models, and they're not used anymore for human models, except in two very specific places, one of which we'll talk today, and the other which we'll talk about whenever we get to the nervous system. Anatomists have already decided this 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. So it just hasn't been distilled throughout all of the textbook writers yet. So that's why it's still included in a lot of the textbooks. And in the clinic, if you see anyone probably over the age of like 27 or 30, they'll probably still use ventral and dorsal. So it's important to be familiar with both, but going forward, practice using anterior and posterior. All right, so moving on. Then we have superior and inferior. So superior is towards the head, and inferior is towards the feet. So this is kind of an easy one to remember because you can kind of think of like being superior, and so you're standing up above other people, and then inferior, you look down below at the other people, so to speak. Next, we'll talk about towards the middle, medial, or towards the side, lateral. So if you say something is towards something is medial to something else, you might say that the belly button is medial to the arm, and you might say that the arm is lateral to the belly button. That is how you would use those terms. And what this line is actually pointing to specifically, this dotted line, is actually called the midline of the body. So that is the most central point of the body. Next, we need to talk about how we talk about different points of reference for an arm or a leg, so extremities. We're going to use the terms proximal and distal for that. So this is only for both of these, for both the arms and the legs. This is only for extremities. So only for legs and arms. You would not use this for anything in the torso or in the pelvis or in the head. Only legs and arms. So you would say, for example, that something is proximal. Anything that's proximal is towards the center of the body, is towards the thorax and abdomen, and anything that is distal is away from the thorax and abdomen and pelvis. So you could say that the knee is somewhere in between the ankle and the hip, but you would say that the knee is more proximal to the hip than the ankle. And you could say the ankle is more distal to the hip than the knee. So things like that. So you could say, like, you know, the injury is a little bit more distal from the knee, but proximal to the ankle if the pain was somewhere here, for example. All right, last but not least, we have here inferior and superior, just like I mentioned over here. And like I said, some books just haven't updated their terminology. So cranial and caudal is usually what we use in animal models. And typically you don't see this at all in any other part of human anatomy. You might hear people refer to it that way, but it's really not standard use. All right, so next is planes. I'm not going to go over planes too much in detail because you have a really nice video that explains and visualizes exactly what's going on, so be sure to refer to that video. All right, cavities. Next, we have two cavities that we need to be really specific in determining what's actually in them. So a cavity is like a space. And like I said, we're going to talk about dorsal and ventral in two specific places in human anatomy. One is here, and the other is going to be in the nervous system. So these are the two places, or this is one out of the two places where we actually refer to it as the dorsal cavity or the posterior cavity, or the ventral or the anterior cavity. So in the posterior cavity, we have two subcavities or subsections within that space, the cranial section and the spinal section. So the cranial, as you can imagine, is going to contain the brain, and the spinal section is going to contain the spinal cord. All right, so that's everything in the posterior section. Anterior section, we have the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So this is just separating out what is contained within the central portion of the human body. So the thoracic cavity is going to have heart and lungs, and the abdominal pelvic cavity is going to have pretty much all the other organs. So stomach, liver, kidneys, the urogenital system, everything inferior in that cavity. And what's separating these two is called the respiratory diaphragm. And that's what's going to be separating the superior portion of the ventral or anterior cavity, which is the thoracic region, and that's separating the thoracic region from the abdominal pelvic region. Then we have other terms that we use to actually describe what's going on within these cavities. So each organ is going to have its own set of membranes or layers that will help separate it from other organs. It might separate it from other organs because there might be some fluid that needs to separate the two. That's part of the functionality of what that organ does. Or it might just need to be separated from other organs so that it doesn't rub up against other organs. And we don't want to create a lot of friction whenever one organ is bumping up against another. For example, the heart is beating all of the time, right? So it's always constantly moving, versus the stomach might only work whenever you have a meal. So we don't want any high friction organs like the heart to be bumping up against the lungs and also produce a lot more heat to the other organs. So usually we have, that's one of the main functions of those membranes. And we have terms for the individual membranes. So the ones that are really, really close, very, very close, V for very close, are the ones that are immediately covering an organ. And we call those visceral membranes. And then we also have parietal, and those are the ones that are further away, not miles away, but maybe a couple centimeters, maybe inches, it just depends on the organ. And those will help adhere each organ to the wall of that cavity that it's within. So for example, all of your guts, your large intestine and your small intestine, you don't want those just floating around nilly-willy, not having really any directed place of where to sit. They need to be anchored to something. So some of their membranous tissue will actually become parietal tissue, and all of that parietal tissue will adhere to the rest of the parietal tissue within the abdominal pelvic cavity. So that's why we have these terms. It's to help us really isolate exactly what we're talking about whenever we're talking about the human body. So here's a picture of the cavities that we talked about. So here we have the posterior or the dorsal cavity that contains the brain and spinal cord. Or we have the anterior cavity or the ventral cavity, which contains the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, or excuse me, the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be separated specifically. Sorry, that's my dog. Which can be separated into the abdominal and the pelvic cavities individually. The thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal pelvic region by the respiratory diaphragm. All right, so next let's talk about how we can even identify what's one organ from another organ, and why do we even care, and how do organs even work in the first place? So we have to talk about the smallest piece of an organ or an organ system, and that would be a cell. And a cell is considered the smallest unit of life, the smallest functional unit of life that can exist on its own, it can reproduce on its own, and it will contribute to the functionality of all the nearby cells, but that one cell itself is going to have its own set of jobs to perform and do. And those cells are really important for a number of reasons, and it depends on what organ system they're a part of and how they perform those functions. But here's some examples: metabolism, assimilation, digestion, excretion, and reproduction, which we'll all talk about as we go through the individual organ systems. So if we assemble a bunch of cells together, then we get tissues. And tissues are a large section of the same type of cell. So you're not going to have a tissue that contains a bunch of other different types of cell. So a tissue might be like a muscle tissue where you're going to have a bunch of the same types of muscle cells. But you're not going to have any of those muscle cells in the same tissue of, let's say your bone, your leg bone. You're not going to have any like muscle cells sandwiched next to bone cells, because that wouldn't make up an individual tissue. So all the same type of cells are going to be sandwiched up against each other to make a uniform tissue. And we have different types of tissue. We have epithelial. Those are covering and protecting other structures. We have connective. Those are the ones that are going to be connecting individual structures to other structures. Muscle tissues, which are providing movement. And nervous tissue, which connects, it provides the brain a way to communicate with the rest of the body. Hey, you need to do this. Hey, you need to do that. And in order to remember all of these four, I think of the 4 C's. So for epithelial, you'll have cover. For connective, you'll have connect. For muscle, you'll have contract. And for nervous, you'll have communicate. So if that helps you remember the 4 tissues, feel free to use that. If you combine a bunch of tissues together, then you have a single organ, and then all of those individual organs can make up an individual organ system, and we have 11 of those. So an example of an organ: liver, stomach, heart, lungs, brain, skin, etc., etc. So we'll have 11 body systems or 11 organ systems that we'll actually talk about for the rest of this course that are individually laid out in individual chapters. So we'll go through them one by one. Here's a brief overview, but like I said, each individual chapter will go into more detail. So first, the largest is the integumentary system. This consists of the skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands. All right, sweat, I totally know what that's about. What's sebaceous mean? Well, those are all of the oils. So think, all of those lovely things that turn into zits at some point in time, or blackheads. Those are all of the oils. We call those sebaceous glands, and they secrete sebum. And the functions of the integumentary system, since they wrap around the rest of the body, is essentially protection. Protection from physical abrasions, protection from the weather, protection from other temperatures, protection from losing any water, which right here, regulation of water and temperature, and also insulation. So you might think that fat is a part of insulation, and it definitely is, but the integumentary system by itself can also perform this function. Next body system is the skeletal system. This consists of the bones, cartilage, and membranous structures. So bones, relatively self-explanatory there. Cartilage, this is going to be the protective connective tissue that is going to be separating from bone to bone so that bones don't have to rub up against each other. And then we have membranous structures that help separate out each of these individual bones from other bones. And the function of the skeletal system is support. Support for protecting other organs, A, and B, support for muscles so that they can anchor to the bone so that they can produce movement. And what do I mean by anchor? Well, let's take your arm for a second, and as a heads up, I am terrible at drawing people, which you would think as an anatomy instructor I would be able to do such a thing, but no chance. So let's zoom into what the arm looks like, right? So we have your nice humerus here, which has your biceps, and then you have your forearm, and then you've got your hands, right, with 5 fingers. And we need to have a way for the forearm to move towards or away from the humerus. And I'm going to put humerus here, and the forearm has the radius and the ulna, so I'll just abbreviate R and U here for now. And in order to have these move, right, if I have a bone right here and 2 bones here, right, what on earth is going to make them want to move together, right? They're just bones, they're just these solid structures. They have to have a way to move to each other. And so in order to do that, we're going to connect them with a muscle. But we don't want to connect the muscle just right here, right? Because if that muscle shortens and gets shorter like this, it's not going to pull this arm up towards the other part of the arm, right? So in order to actually do this, we need to have, and I'll redraw this so it's not a total mess. We need to have that muscle actually stretch from over here to over here. So then that way, whenever it shortens, we actually pull this arm up with it. So the skeletal system is providing those anchor points in order for the muscle system to actually latch on and create movement. Otherwise, the bones would just be stationary and not do anything. In addition to supporting movement and protection, the skeletal system is also in charge of blood production, so producing red blood cells and some white blood cells. Also, not producing fat, but storing fat. It's a different type of fat than the annoying fat that we're all trying to get rid of in some capacity. And also storing minerals as well. So this is all happening within the hollow cavities of the bones. Next body system is the muscular system, which I kind of already introduced with the previous system. Typically, whenever people talk about both systems together, they call it the skeletal muscular system. And you might see this abbreviated as the skeletal. Oh, no, I'm forgetting it. So just ignore that. It's fine. The organs of the muscular system include the muscles, so the big muscle bellies that the big fancy models. You can actually identify them specifically. The fascia, and the fascia, or this is the plural form of fascia. I believe it's pronounced the same way either way. The singular form is this form. If you add an E, it becomes the plural form. So singular form, plural form. Fascia is going to be wrapping around each of the individual muscles to help protect them from other muscles. So just like the same concept with the heart, with the visceral and the parietal layers of the heart, in order to prevent it from causing a lot of heat from all of the friction of it moving all of the time to the other organs. We do the same thing here with muscles too. You don't want your biceps working really, really hard against your coracobrachialis muscle and providing so much heat that the coracobrachialis muscle can't work anymore. So you have some fascia that's separating out each individual muscle belly. You'll also have tendon sheets. So muscle to bone is going to be connected via tendons. And bones connecting to bones are going to be connected via ligaments. And so the ligaments are considered part of the skeletal system, and the tendons, are considered part of the muscular system. So the tendon sheaths, these are wrappings that are wrapping around the tendons, just providing that extra support. Then you also have bursa. So same thing with the plural form with the E at the end. Bursa, singular, it would be spelled like this. Bursa are these like tiny little pockets of fluid-filled like sacs, but they're super, super tiny. You can't see them with the naked eye. Sometimes if they're really big, which they're not supposed to be really big, then you can see them on like an MRI. But typically these should be really, really small. And they're there for an additional support, additional protective measures so that bones don't rub up against other bones, muscles don't rub up against other muscles and or bones. So it functions very similarly to fascia, except fascia is one layer of connective tissue, and bursa are actual like pockets of fluid-filled structures. And the functions of the muscular system, as you would predict, movement. But some other things that we wouldn't necessarily predict include pushing food and blood. So pushing food. So the digestive system is essentially one big tube that's made out of some muscle, and then it has some special tissues in there that can absorb some nutrients, and then you got poop on the other end, right? But it's one big muscular tube. Blood is also special because blood vessels will also have some sort of smooth muscle wrapping around it so that it can help pump and move blood towards the tissues and return blood back to the heart. So we need some muscle in there to help move blood against gravity. And then contracting the heart. So the heart itself is its own type of specialized muscle tissue, which we'll talk a lot about in later chapters. The next body system is the nervous system. And the nervous system is the one that is coordinating this big mess of all these organs and telling them what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and for how long, and when to stop. And in order to do that, we have to have a couple organs in place. So we have the brain. Brain talks to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord has branches coming off of it that are called nerves. And we have some nerves that go to the brain, which are cranial nerves. And we have some nerves that, the cranial nerves come off the brain. And then we have peripheral nerves, and those nerves are going out to the rest of the body wall and limbs. Those nerves contain both sensory and motor structures. So the sensory ones are performing sensory functions. So they are perceiving sensory input in and telling the brain, hey, that was a good sensation or that was a bad sensation. What do you want us to do about it? And then the brain goes, oh, well, that was really hot and really painful. Let's move away from that. So then the brain will send out a motor function to the muscles saying, hey, that's bad, that you're going to burn your skin. Why don't you move away from that hot whatever it is that you're standing next to? And it will perform a motor output function so that your muscle's like, oh, shoot, I got to run away. So sensory can be anything from pain, temperature, proprioception, which we'll talk about, kinesthesia, so where you can actually feel something in your hand, like if you pick something up with your eyes closed, can you tell it's your keys, or can you tell it's a dime or a penny or a quarter? You can tell the difference just by holding it, right? Motor structures, this is like contracting the arm, kicking the leg, moving away from the hot stove, that sort of thing. And the function of the nervous system, other than coordinating all of this, is also partly interpreting what the stimuli are, right? So the nervous system has to somehow talk with our special senses and say, oh, wow, that was a really tasty jelly bean. Oh, wow, that was a really terrible jelly bean. That's okay milk. That smells like and tastes like rotten milk. And your brain has to interpret all of these stimuli all of the time. And so that your nervous system is tasked with all of this. Next body system is the endocrine system. Endocrine system is a very complicated system that contains a bunch of endocrine glands and organs. So I don't know why they're not listed here, but we'll go through it in detail in the other chapters. But these are things like the thymus are part of the endocrine system. The pancreas is part of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus in the brain is part of the thalamus is part of the endocrine system. And these are all really fancy organs that are glandular in nature, and they are very good at communicating really long distances to other parts of the body with hormones or chemical signals. And they work in tandem with the nervous system in order to help coordinate when these signals need to be released, when they need to not be released, when they are released too much or too little, etc., etc. So the endocrine system is a relatively complicated system. There's people who specialize primarily in just the endocrine system, like endocrinologists. Maybe a patient with diabetes might have their own specific endocrinologist who specializes in just diabetes to help treat them because their pancreas is out of whack, or maybe something else is out of whack. So anyway, endocrine system, complicated, but hormones as chemical messengers. Alrighty, next body system. Cardiovascular system. Cardio, heart, vascular, the arteries and veins, and the capillaries, which are the connecting point between arteries and veins. So the heart, as you can imagine, takes blood in, pumps blood out, and it has to do this all of the time without you even thinking about it. It's not too complicated, it's nice and organized, but you have to have some sort of system that is solely responsible for moving blood throughout the entire body, because the blood itself is going to contain a bunch of nutrients that need to get to those tissues. So the function, transport substances to and from cells. Next body system is lymphatic or immune system. The organs that are included in here are the lymph nodes, lymph vessels, thymus, and spleen. Did I put thymus up here? I meant to put thyroid. I meant to put thyroid gland. Sorry about that. get those backwards sometimes. Don't do that. Don't be me. All right, so lymphatic immune system. Lymph nodes. So these are the things that doctors will palpate for, maybe at the base of your mandible, base of your jaw, to see if they're swollen. And lymph nodes are really important because they're going to see, oh, hey, I went and I sampled this little environment over here and I noticed that there was a virus or bacteria over here and we probably shouldn't have that. So I'm going to try to capture this mess and take care of it myself. But in case I fail, can we have some specific cells on backup ready to come and attack at any point? Cool, thanks. And so that's what that system is doing all the time, in various places in your body. You'll have lymph nodes in your armpits, behind the knee, in your neck, behind your stomach. There's lots of places. The lymph vessels are the ways that the lymph nodes are going to be talking to each other. Lymph is going to be traveling to and from those lymph nodes and throughout the rest of the entire body. And eventually, it will all get drained back into the bloodstream. So we need lymph vessels to carry lymph around. The thymus gland and spleen. So the spleen is going to be responsible for cleaning out red blood cells and recirculating the parts of the red blood cell so that we can build new red blood cells because they don't last for a very long time in the body. And then the thymus gland is really important in helping develop mature T cells versus the skeletal system will help develop mature B cells. So T for thymus, B for bone. So that's nice. They labeled that nicely. And the immune system, complicated system. There's lots of stuff going on in the immune system. There's lots of stuff changing in terms of the science that we think we understand about the immune system. So we'll get into that in detail whenever we get to that chapter as well. All right, respiratory system, breathing. Organs include nasal cavities, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. How do you remember the difference between pharynx and larynx? I will stay tuned for that. We will talk about that in that chapter. Nasal cavities is where your nose is, so that's where you're going to be bringing in all of that air, and then it'll help clean and moisturize that air before it actually goes into your lungs, and you can use the oxygen in the air for the rest of the tissues to operate at their normal function. So the whole point of the respiratory system is we bring in oxygen, or O2. You might see it O subscript 2. And then breathing out CO2 because we don't need carbon dioxide anymore. So carbon dioxide or oxygen gas. This is just gas. They're both gas, but this would be considered oxygen gas. This would be considered carbon dioxide gas. Dioxide gas. Alrighty. Next body system is the digestive system. This is one of my favorite systems. Food in, poop out. Yes. How do we do that? One big muscular tube, like I mentioned before, and the name of that muscular tube is called the alimentary canal or alimentary canal. It's also been called the GI system, gastrointestinal system. You might hear it the GI tract. Lots of fun terms for this, right? We also have just as many fun terms to call poop different things too, right? So lots of fun things here. And basically, from beginning to end, we've got the mouth all the way down to the anus. So food in, food out. Or, excuse me, not food out. Food and nutrients in, and then things that we can't use out. Some glands that are assisting the digestive system and doing what it needs to do include the salivary glands, which are in the mouth, for the most part. The liver, which is going to help process fats, and the pancreas, which will help us process proteins. You all might have noticed that the pancreas was also already included in the endocrine system. Pancreas is in both systems. It has it's tied to two different systems, and it does two different jobs. The functions of the digestive system: eat in that lovely food, take away the nutrients that we need to, poop out the rest, eliminate waste. Next body system, urinary system. So same thing, fluids in, fluids out. So fluids that we need in, right? So essentially, hopefully water. And then out are all of the extra ions or electrolytes that we might not need anymore. And they're going to be condensed and concentrated into what we call urine. And we're going to try to hold on to water as much as possible. So you shouldn't have a lot of water in the urine, just enough to keep it so that it doesn't hurt you on the way out, essentially. The organs of the urinary system include the kidneys, ureters, bladder, urethra. Do not confuse ureters and urethra when we get there. Don't be tricked by that. Those are two different words. And we have two kidneys and they are paired. The bladder is so the kidneys are going to be creating urine, It'll travel through two ureters on both sides, be stored in the bladder, and then passed out through the urethra for both males and females. Functions of the urinary system are formation and elimination of urine, chemical regulation of blood, which is kind of special, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily think that the urinary system would have such a complex role in maintaining homeostasis, which is something we'll talk about at the end of this chapter, but it has a very large role in maintaining homeostasis. Part of which is making sure that the blood composition, everything that is flowing in and out of the blood that is and isn't supposed to be there, is actually well maintained. So the kidneys are going to help filter out that blood. Next is the reproductive system, my next favorite organ system for sure. Organs include for women, so these are people who are born with ovaries or female reproductive parts. Males are considered males at birth if they're born with male reproductive parts, but there are many combinations thereof, and intersex people who are born with both male and female reproductive parts. So for women, we separate this out into ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus, and the vagina. So the ovaries is where the egg will be manufactured. It will be taken down the uterine tubes to be in the uterus, and the vagina will be used as part of this, is used as a sex organ, where the penis from the male can inject the sperm to meet the egg, hopefully somewhere in the uterine tube, and then eventually baby gets implanted in the uterus. 9 months later, boom, boom, woohoo, fun. For men, we have testes. Testes is where the sperm are being manufactured. Those will travel through the seminal vesicles. They'll travel through the various tubes. I don't want to get too confusing here. It'll travel through various tubes. It will receive some juices, for lack of a better term, to help lubricate and help protect the sperm on their journey. Those juices will come from the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and eventually the urethra will help pass the sperm through and potentially produce a fertilization and produce a baby. Functions of the reproductive system, other than perpetuating the species by reproducing and creating multiples, also maintaining sexual characteristics, so physical characteristics, hormonal characteristics, not necessarily personality. That's not part of the reproductive system at all. That's part of the nervous system, but also maintaining like sexual satisfaction, and maintaining homeostasis with the hypothalamus as well. All right, so what is homeostasis? You've said homeostasis so many times. Homeostasis is this balancing act that your body is doing every single day, all day, every day, in many different capacities. And the good news is you never have to think about it. Otherwise, you would burn so many calories, you probably wouldn't be able to function at all at work at all, ever. It's a very complicated system, but it's relatively easy to explain. I really like to think about homeostasis as a teeter-totter. So if I'm at the park, and this is like my gravel pit here, and I've got my little teeter-totter. And this is going to be a terrible picture of a teeter-totter, so bear with me. But you can imagine this teeter-totter, right? And you've got one kid on one side, and you've got another kid on the other side, right? And they're going to be bouncing back and forth. So homeostasis is essentially where this bar is flat. Excuse me, that is not what I mean to say. One sec, I'll get to what flat means. Homeostasis is this bouncing back and forth. So where one gets high, then it's like, ooh, that's too high, let's bounce it back, and it'll get the other one high, and it'll do this game back and forth, right? So just like kids on a teeter-totter. What happens if you end up at this, where it's level, where that seesaw is right in the middle, that's called equilibrium. And equilibrium essentially means you're dead. Which I don't mean to laugh about that, but that really means that your cells aren't doing anything anymore because they're not able to go one way or the other. They're not able to produce too much of one thing or too little of another thing, and there's no homeostasis, no feedback back and forth in order to continue maintaining regular function. So you never really want to be at equilibrium. That's bad news bears. You really want to be one way and then have the ability to get to the other way, to be able to manipulate that teeter-totter back and forth. So homeostasis is this manipulation, bouncing back and forth. And it's really important, and it is very, very specific, And it can be modulated or moved by many different factors like hormones, chemical signals, maybe the nervous system is talking to other organs and telling it what to do, and that it'll help modulate or move the teeter-totter back and forth. And whenever it's moving it back and forth, we call that a negative feedback loop. So let's say that the teeter-totter is really high on one side. Well, in order to make it go back down to the other side, we're going to implement a negative feedback loop, in order to get the teeter-totter back down, and vice versa. There's something called a positive feedback loop as well, but we'll focus on negative feedback loop first. So examples of a negative feedback loop might be blood sugar levels. Let's say it's your birthday. Happy birthday. You just ate a cake. Yay, yum, love cake. That's awesome. Cake has a lot of sugar in it. Cake is yummy. But you have a lot of sugar, right? So your body's like, okay, well, wow, that's awesome. Let's take some of that sugar. All right, I took enough of that sugar. Now I'm done taking sugar. I don't need any more sugar. So how do we stop and prevent from all of that sugar being absorbed into your tissues? Well, you're going to have to release and do this kind of like teeter-totter balancing act between some hormones so that some hormones are turned on in order to bring in glucose. And then once you bring in enough glucose, then those hormones get turned off so you don't bring as much glucose into the body. Another example might be body temperature. So let's say you're like me and you walk outside and you immediately start sweating because it's 80 plus degrees outside, right? So how do I cool myself off? I have to activate some sort of mechanism so that I don't overheat, so that I don't pass out, so I don't have a heat stroke and lay somewhere and hope that one of you come to save me. So you have to have some sort of mechanism to help cool your body down. The other mechanism is also true, right? If I'm really, really cold, how do I get myself warm? I have to turn on some sort of mechanism to get myself warm. So in order to do that, I start to shiver, right? All my muscles start rubbing up against each other. They create a lot of friction. That friction produces heat. That heat makes me feel warmer. And slowly but surely, then enough blood gets to all of my tissues and I feel warm again. So these are just some examples of homeostasis with negative feedback loops specifically. Specifically for the blood glucose levels, this is exactly what's actually happening for that that hormonal balance that I was talking about. So first, whenever you eat that cake, you'll have a lot of glucose in your system. You want to store some of that glucose. So you're going to use insulin for that. Insulin is going to grab onto that glucose, hold on to it, bring it into the tissues, and store it for whenever you need it again in case you don't have a meal. Then you're done eating your meal. You have a lot of glucose. The rest of the glucose gets passed or stored somewhere else. And now you haven't eaten a meal. You ate your cake 2 days ago, and let's say you haven't eaten anything since. Well, you're starving, right? But your body still has to process and go through its regular cell functions as it normally would. So it has to initiate an activation of another hormone so that you have enough glucose floating around for your cells to continue their function. Because the glucose is going to be that food resource for those cells in order for them to do what they need to do. And that hormone is glucagon. So glucagon, you can imagine, is on one end of that teeter-totter, and insulin is going to be on the other end of that teeter-totter. And I'm just going to draw a line like this because I can't draw teeter-totters. So let's say you have really high glucose. You just ate that cake, right? You're going to have really high insulin levels and relatively low glucagon levels, right? But let's say that time has passed. I'll do like an hourglass here. Time has passed. And now you're done eating your cake. You don't have as much glucose floating around in your bloodstream. Now you need to invert this situation, right? So now glucagon needs to be high and insulin needs to be low, right? And they're going to teeter-totter. They're going to go back and forth. One is going to be high, one is going to be low. But there's always going to be some amount of either of them, right? Because it's a lot easier to have both of them floating around in some capacity and have one a little bit more than the other so that your body has some sort of starting point so that it can keep adding to that starting point. Okay, body temperature. So the example of stepping outside and sweating or coming inside and being super cold. How do you adjust to that? How does homeostasis kick in order for you to adjust to those scenarios? So if you step outside, it's really hot. What do? You start sweating. And whenever you sweat, all of that water stays on your skin, or your sweat stays on your skin, And then the wind, which may be a lot, maybe a little, or just the air in general, is going to pick up that water because the air will have less water in it than your skin. So water will move from a high concentration on your skin to a low concentration in the air. And once it leaves your body will feel cooler. Your skin will feel cooler. It's called evaporative cooling, where the water is evaporating off of your skin and leaving behind a drier space, and therefore you feel cooler. And that water that's on your skin is also trapping in the heat that your blood vessels have at any time. So by moving that heat away from your body, you feel cooler. Then the opposite is also true. If you feel cold and you need to, sorry, that's my chair squeaking. If you feel cold and you start shivering, all of your muscles are starting to work and produce friction so that you can create enough heat to pass off that heat to all of your other tissues so you feel warm again. But this process takes time, right? It's not instant. You don't like shiver for a second and then all of a sudden you feel okay. It takes some time. And what's happening in that time are your blood vessels, instead of being super constricted and saving and salvaging essentially your important organs, so things that are in your ventral and dorsal cavities, so your essential organs, it'll squeegee off all that blood so that all of that blood is still being able to be used for your organs, for your essential organs, so that you can live. And so slowly, as you start contracting your muscles and you're shivering, all of that heat will have to dissipate somewhere, and your blood will need to start moving so all of your muscles can continue to shiver. And slowly but surely, all of your blood vessels will continue to expand so that all of the blood can go back to your extremities so that you feel warm collectively again. If you don't believe me, I don't recommend that you do this by any means, but if you don't believe me, stand outside in a snowstorm if you have snow around you, and don't be naked because, rules, but stand outside in shorts and a tank top or short sleeve shirt, and don't do this for too long, but wait and see what feels cold first. Is it your hands? Is it your toes? Is it your knees? Is it your belly button? Is it your face? Like, what feels cold first, right? It's going to be the smaller, most distal parts of your body that will feel cold first because they won't have as much blood traveling to them, because slowly all of your blood vessels want to constrict and hold on to your most vital organs and provide them the blood supply rather than like fingers and toes, which might not be as important for survival. All right, that's enough about homeostasis in terms of blood glucose and body temperature. Let's go back to that negative feedback loop thing. So negative feedback, that's where you are turning off one signal and turning it into another signal. Maybe you have too much of one thing and you need to turn it into another thing. Like you have too much glucose. Okay, now you need to get rid of glucose. And now you need to, what if you don't have enough glucose? Then you need to turn glucose back on. Or if you step outside, too hot, now you need to start sweating, you need to let go of that heat. But at some point that system has to be turned off, right? So it has to go back in the opposite direction. So that's called a negative feedback loop. But what's a positive feedback loop? So let's say, and this is kind of strange, but let's keep with the body temperature thing. Let's say you go outside and you start sweating. And for whatever reason, sweating is a good thing. You are sweating a lot and your body likes that you're sweating a lot, and that seems like a good idea. So you keep sweating and you keep sweating and you keep sweating, and your body's like, oh, that's good, let's keep sweating. So to keep you sweating. Now, obviously, we all know this is a bad idea, right? You'll lose enough water, you'll lose enough electrolytes, you'll eventually pass out, might get a nice sunburn, yada, yada. So there's an actual mechanism in the body. There are a couple mechanisms in the body that use this process, but for a beneficial purpose. The primary one, that's the easiest one to understand, is in labor. So when a woman is about to, when someone with a uterus is about to have a baby, and they're close to term, hopefully, baby will say, hey, knock, knock, I want to come out, right? And so where it knocks is going to be the cervix, or the most inferior portion of the uterus. And when it knocks on the cervix is like, all right, I hear you. And it goes and it tells the brain, hey, time to deliver the baby. And the brain is like, okay, cool, let me send down this hormone. And that hormone is going to tell the uterus to start contracting so that the uterus can start pushing baby out. Well, now we don't want one contraction, boom, baby out, right? That's like spreading tissues way too fast, way too quickly, and pain and blood and tearing, and that just wouldn't work well for anyone. So instead, we kind of do this slowly and a little bit over time, or maybe very quickly, depending on the labor. But that hormone is going to be continuously sent out to the uterus for the uterus to continue to contract until baby is all the way out. So that's going to be a positive feedback loop. We're going to continuously send out that hormone until the uterus is like, cool, all right, baby's out, we're done, happy day, and you move on. So that's called a positive feedback loop, where right where that oxytocin keeps getting released in until baby actually comes out. So that's a positive feedback loop. And like we mentioned before, homeostasis, we're just talking about how organ systems are able to help actually control the internal environment at any given time, all the time. And at the end of each of these lecture notes, you'll see that there are a summary slide, and these are the bullet points that will match with your modules for each week of what you really need to know from each chapter. So at the end of the day, before the exam, before your assessments, are you able to actually explain these 3 topics? And if so, then you should have a pretty good handle on what's going on in chapter 1. I'll see you again in chapter 2.